Rhetoric is simply the use of language to persuade, and it can be used to persuade us of falsehoods as well as truths. Julian Baggini, philosopher, journalist, and author. All right, welcome to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, I want to especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Today, I've got quite a bit to go through. This is kind of going to be heavy. I mean, like for 7 a.m., 7:15 a.m., it's a bit heavy today, but that's okay. I think you can manage. What am I doing today? Well, you might have seen that Candace Owens has separated from the Daily Wire. Not particularly much interest to me, right? People come and go from businesses. That's fine. But I did see the episode that she did with Rabbi Barclay. And as I was watching it, I was like, wow, like some of his rhetoric is just like it's bad. And I don't mean like it wasn't like intelligent necessarily. I'm just like I don't realize I don't know if he realizes the impact and the manner in which that comes across. So I figured I would take an opportunity to discuss it. Now, their video was I think their interview was like over an hour and a half, like somewhere around there, and there was a lot in there. And if I walked through the whole video, it would probably be like a 4-hour video, right, discussing like every little nuance. And so I had to really narrow it down the best I could. And so I narrowed it down to three things. I think we can talk now, mind you, she, the reason that she had him on the show was he wrote a scathing article about her. And she brought him on the show because she was like, and she says this, she's like, I believe that you bring somebody on the show, you give them a platform so they can, you can work it out, you can air out because the value of free speech is that you combat bad speech with more speech, right? So she wasn't like, hey, I'm going to shut you down. Fine, bring you on. Let's talk. And so she wanted to go through this article that he wrote and address some of the things that she felt were, mistruths that weren't accurate. And so in doing so, I just noticed three things, three major things. Some of the rhetoric allows people to escape criticism. There is this issue of moral equivalency that keeps getting brought up. Anytime you criticize what the Israeli government is doing over in Gaza, it's immediately responded to with like, well, you're making a moral equivalency. So we're going to discuss that. And then there is very clearly a double standard. So I will be addressing all three of those. I've got some clips that I will play, and a number of clips. And I did my best to narrow down these clips to only what is absolutely necessary, to display on this show. Okay, so like usually, the one thing that I hate about clips is that you can pull out a clip, and even like say a 2 minute clip, right? And sometimes even like a 2 or even 3 minute clip is completely out of context. So I did my best to narrow it down so I'm not playing like, most of her show. And what I'll do is I will, in the show notes, I will add the timestamp where I pulled the clip so that anybody who wants to go back and maybe listen to a few moments before or a few moments after the clip that I used, they can do so. Okay. And then you can determine whether or not I clipped it and then at least represented what was being said accurately. Because here on the Liberty Dad Show, what we try to do is represent arguments accurately to the best of our ability and not use, like, I've seen people where they'll clip something out and the full context is someone saying like, saying something like, they don't like the idea that I don't know. They're saying one thing, and then in the clip, it makes it look like they're saying something entirely different, right? And those are the things that we want to try to avoid, and we don't want to clip somebody, make it sound like they're saying something other than they are, and then present an argument for that, also known as a straw man. We don't want to attack an argument that was never made. That's not appropriate, and that's a waste of your time as a viewer or a listener, right? Like, I can do better than that. I'm not going to waste your time by beating up on arguments that were never made. So let's play this first clip here, and most of these clips are going to be in chronological order. The first two clips from her show are actually a little bit out of order. I'm going to play one and then I'll kind of backtrack a little bit. It will make sense for what I'm discussing. So let's go ahead and play this first clip, and then we're going to discuss it real quickly here.
For me personally, if I thought that racism could just be an ever shifting definition based on the experience of Black people, it would be a remarkable power, and I would be able to create something like BLM, which could say that everything was racist. So I am not going to be able to agree that definition should be able to transform according to what's happening during the day. But here's what I will say. If you could, just because I think it's really important for us to get to going through this article, because then you might be able to explain why you view it as anti-Semitism. If you could just give us what you are saying the current definition of anti-Semitism is today, that would be very helpful.
Okay, so I want to pause it right there for just a moment. So prior to that, she was talking about like anti-Semitic. So in his article about her, he claims that she's doing a lot of anti-Semitic things. And so she's asking like, okay, well, what's this definition of anti-Semitism so that we're on the same page? Because it does nobody any good if two people are talking about an idea and they both have entirely different ideas about that concept, right? About what they're talking about. And so she had asked him, like, hey, give me a definition of anti-Semitism. And he's going through and he's like, all right, well, it used to be this one thing. He says, it started out as being based on religion, then it became based on their race, and then it became based on the nation. So it's like, so, and I think that's in the clip that I'm going to play here in a moment. But he basically kind of says, like, this definition has mutated. And he actually uses a phrase, hate that mutates. And so he's basically saying, like, over time, you have seen like say different implementations of what it means to be anti-Semitic. Like, it started out as being expressed this way. Now it's being expressed this way. Now it's being expressed this new way. So she's asking, she's like, all right, the current one, not what it might have been 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago.
The current definition of anti-Semitism today has to do with what the feelings are. It has to do with anti-Zionism, number one. That is a definition. Anti-Zionism, anti-Israel is anti-Semitism.
Okay.
This is
so you believe that Jewish people can be anti-Semitic.
Absolutely.
Okay. So when you see a
And-
gathering of Jewish people who say, I'm Jewish, but I don't support Israel or Bibi Netanyahu, you say that person can be anti-Semitic.
You just did two different things and was very, you just did two different things that were totally unrelated, Candace.
Okay.
You said that.
Okay, so I want you to pay attention closely here to how so she just said like, okay, so a Jewish person can be anti-Semitic, for instance, if that Jewish person were to oppose things that Israel's doing, or Bibi Netanyahu, who happens to be the current prime minister of Israel.
You said the Jews that do not support Israel.
Yes.
And you said Jews that do not support Bibi Netanyahu.
I'm just saying that because he's the current prime minister. So I'm saying like if they say I don't support.
No, this is where you're missing the point. So
Okay.
I'm going to go under the following premise.
Mhm.
Okay. I'm going to go under the premise that you care about people. You and I don't know each other, but I'm going to go under that premise. I'm going to go under the premise that you have no desire to ever hurt anyone.
Mhm.
Okay. That's the premise I'm coming into this dialogue with. You have been devastatingly hurtful. And I think that I'm going to go from that you don't understand what it means to the Jewish world.
Mhm.
There's a great teaching that comes out of every sociologist, every person in academics, is that I don't get to tell a black man if he's experiencing racism.
Mhm.
He knows. I don't get to tell you if you're experiencing misogyny. You know. If I make a comment and it's misogynistic, and you say, Rabbi, that was really misogynistic, my job is to say, wow, I didn't mean that. I apologize. That's not what I meant. And you do not get the right to say what is anti-Semitic or Jew hatred.
Okay, so what's very interesting is he was trying to clarify and say, like, okay, so a Jewish person could be anti-Semitic, instance this way, they oppose, maybe they're not very supportive of Israel or Israel's actions, or maybe they're not very supportive of the current prime minister. And he's like, okay, well, you did two things. And that's fair. Like, I get it. You could have less regard for a particular prime minister than you do, say, the nation state, right? Like, I could dislike Obama, or not Obama. I'm sorry, the current president, President Biden. I could have a strong disdain for President Biden, but still, like America for the most part, and maybe have a few issues with America, right? Like, so that makes sense to distinguish them. But he doesn't really finish his statement. He just kind of goes into this, well, you don't get to tell me what is what is anti-Semitism, what is Jew hatred. You don't get to say that, right? You're excluded from this conversation, from working with this definition, like identifying what the definition actually would truly be. You just get to be told that. And then he goes on and he says, well, as a black person, I can't tell you what is and is not racism. I can, he says, as a woman, I can't tell you what is and is not misogyny. And this is what I mean. This is a very common thing, right? This is not something that's specific to the rabbi, and nor is it specific to Jewish people. This is just a common tactic. And when I say tactics here, when I say that there's bad rhetoric, it could be intentional. It could be that's just how you've learned to defend your ideas, right? So you're not really thinking of it in terms of like, I'm going to get over on this person by using this particular, rhetoric, rhetorical play, right? Like, I don't know that it's quite that devious. I mean, it could be, but I'm going to assume that it's not. I'm just going to assume that this is what people have learned. And so we need to have these kind of discussions so that we can identify them and we can say, like, no, this is, this is wrong. Now, what I want to do is I want to butt up that comment against another gentleman. Might have heard of his name, Martin Luther King Jr. So he gave a speech called The Other America. And he does something entirely different. So I want to play this clip, and then we're going to kind of talk about the distinction here. So let me play this clip, and remember that what we just heard from Rabbi Barclay was, um, you know, Jewish anti-Semitism is, disliking it is anti-Zionism, right? It's like having a problem with Israel, um, and you can be Jewish and you can be anti-Semitic, and that nobody else but a Jewish person gets to make the decision on what is anti-Semitic. So I want you to hear what Martin Luther King says in his. This is a clip from his speech, and again, everything will be in the show notes, so you can go take a listen.
To use a philosophical analogy here, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it.
Okay, so very short clip. You can again go listen to the longer version, and I don't think you're going to find anything different here. But what's interesting is he says, to use an analogy, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It's based rather on ontological affirmation, the assertion that certain people are behind culturally otherwise because of environmental conditions, or it is not the assertion, right? It is the affirmation that a very being of a people is inferior. So he does something very unique there. And you don't hear it very often, like at all these days. And I've talked about this in past episodes. What he does is he says he defines what racism is, and he also tells you what it isn't, right? And by doing that, he makes it clear when criticism could be considered racism and when it's not. And to my knowledge, and I could be wrong because I haven't listened to every single recording that Dr. King has put out, nor have I read every single thing that he has ever written. But to my knowledge, at no point did he say, "Oh, by the way, only Black people get to decide what is racism." And I believe here is kind of why, because he doesn't have to. It's defined as this you by your very being is inferior. So he makes it very clear that racism is about how one views another person at their core, at their being. But then he also goes along and says, but if you have some criticism, I mean, he doesn't quite say it this way, but he says, if you have criticism, you have a generalization about a group of people related to, that are related to, environmental conditions. Well, that's not racism, right? And so it would be the equivalent if Rabbi Barclay had said something like, well, anti-Semitism is, it's not based on empirical generalization. It's based on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that maybe the Jewish people shouldn't be doing this, or that there are environmental conditions that are causing this particular thing to happen, that you're criticizing. It is the affirmation that the very being of Jews is inferior, right? Or something along that line, right? And so that would be the distinction. And so I think it's very interesting when we compare the two, we see that that there's not really much need to debate what racism is. And most everybody would agree. I mean, maybe not at the time because there were still a lot of racists. And of course, they're not going to be like, or maybe they were, right? Maybe because, again, at the time, racism was actually generally well accepted in terms of by those who were being racist. Like you didn't have to worry about being a racist. Nobody was going to out you from your job necessarily, right? Like you could be like, yeah, I'm a racist. I hate those terrible Black people, right? Whatever. And you could say all kind of mean and nasty things, and more than likely you weren't going to get canceled or lose your job or what have you, right? In fact, it may actually benefit you in some way at the time. So, but it's interesting to compare these two because I see it a lot, and this is what I mean when I say that this is escaping criticism, because the definition, it distinctly forces people to accept whatever is thrown at them. So if I'm talking to a Jewish person and I acknowledge that Jewish hate or anti-Semitism is defined uh, determined by a Jewish person, I don't get to argue that, right? Like, and he says, like, your job would be to just be like, oh, I apologize. I didn't mean to say that, so on and so forth, right? Like, I can't argue and say, well, no, it's not. But here's the problem with that. Hatred is something, if you take two people, you got person A, you have person B. Hatred is what person A maybe does or acts upon or says. It's kind of like this something inside of them has this hatred, right? Like there's some motivation, there's something there. But in his definition, he's basically saying, like, well, person B gets to define it without question, which means that person B gets to define the intent of person A at all times. So let's say that I say something and I don't know, maybe I don't know some history behind it, right? I say a phrase and I don't know the history behind it. I heard it in a different context, and person B says, "Well, that's racist." That's fact. I tell you what. Let me give you a real example from my own life. Okay. Um, Anybody that's been any audience member that's listened a while knows that I used to be a youth director when I was in my 20s. And I would drive the church van and I would go around the city and I would pick up different kids. And one day, I don't remember the exact joke that I made, but I was making a joke and I said something about me being a gringo, right? And hopefully you're familiar with the term, but it's this Spanish term to refer to non-Spanish people, particularly white people, right? So I made some joke about, being a gringo or something like that. And there was a Hispanic girl on the bus and she started screaming at me, like literally screaming at me. She was like, I can't believe you said that. That's a terrible term. And she's accusing me of being a racist. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, one, I'm talking about myself. And then this is like when I went to Mexico, that's what Mexicans called me. They would refer to me as gringo. So I was really, really confused. And she's like accusing me. And so she's arguing and she's like, that means dirty Mexican. And I was like, hey, man, like, what? Wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. Like when I went to Mexico, the Mexicans were calling me gringo. Why would they call me a dirty Mexican? That doesn't mean, and every translator I talked to was like, yeah, that's just the term that they use for white people, right? Like when you go to Indonesia, they'll say bule, right? Like if I heard the word bule in Indonesia, I know they're talking about me because they're basically like the lighter skinned person who is not Indonesian, right? Like that's what that means. It's the same, it's the equivalent. And so I was really, really confused. And I did exactly what Barclay suggested because I didn't know any better at the time. I was like, oh, I don't know. I was like, I'm not doing very well in Spanish class. And, here's a Hispanic girl who has an Hispanic community yelling at me that it means dirt. I think it was either dirty or greasy Mexican. And, that's certainly not what I said, nor was it even the context of my joke. I was making a self-deprecating joke. So, like a week or two later, she actually comes back and she apologized and she said, look, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Right. She said, that's not what it meant. I found out that, it is what you said it was. And I was like, oh, okay, well, no big deal. Right. But this is the problem with this idea is that I got lucky that she found out otherwise and chose to come back and apologize. She could have just ignored it and been like, yeah, whatever. Right. And by his definition that you don't get to, argue the point, that means anytime somebody says something, you just have to capitulate and accept it. And then if they are wrong, then hope that they will come to their senses and find that, yeah, they are wrong. And then also hope that they will come back and apologize. Now, think about how that works out in terms of the conversations and the engagements that we have. That does not improve relationships between different groups of people. That actually exacerbates them and makes them worse because now I could be accused of something that I know is wrong. and or I could be accused of certain level of intent that only I know. I'm the only one that knows my intent. So if I say something to you, it may be offensive. And there are multiple ways that I could say it. I could make a dirty joke to you. Maybe not a dirty joke, but I can make any level of a joke to you. For instance, my wife is Asian. I could be like, "Hey, are you squinting at me?" And I could make that joke just out of pure fun, in the same way that she might say, "Hey, can you reach that on the top shelf?" "Oh, I guess you can't. Let me get it for you," because my wife is like half an inch taller than me. Like we could make these jokes at each other in play, very playfulness, and it could be, like the intent isn't to be mean spirited, or we could make those jokes out of mean spiritedness, right? But the problem is, in this scenario, what's being said is like person B gets to decide, even though they aren't the person. They don't know the intent. I mean, sometimes it's obvious, right? Like if you're yelling at somebody and you're saying some very hateful things, some very mean comments, and using very nasty language, then there's a good chance that I mean, it's the intent, the hate could be very well on display and unmistakable, right? So it's not always that you never know. It's just that there are times where you don't know. And by approaching it this way, you exacerbate relationships because person B doesn't have to be held accountable in the moment or ever. As I pointed out in my story, person B, the young lady, she never had to come back and apologize. I just got lucky that she did, and that she recognized that she accused me of saying racist things when it was entirely untrue. And, so I don't think we should have a society that operates on, hopefully this person comes to their senses and comes back and apologizes. And because I feel like that's gonna make conflict grow more. Because I could have easily just been very bitter about it and been like, well, and went and talked to my friends and got reassurance that no, what I said was not racist. And so then I could have been like, you know what, I'm very bitter at this woman. And and I could have had and then I could assume that any friends of hers were equally aligned with her in those ideas, and I could have disliked them as well. So you see how this spirals out of control, or can, very, very quickly. And so I think we need to have a society where no, you can be challenged when you are making an accusation. And the what we need to what we need to do is create a society where you can be challenged and you have to defend it, but the other person needs to listen, right? Like this needs to be our operating procedure here when it comes to those kind of things. Now, the other interesting thing that I'll point out, and these are questions that weren't answered, but they need to be answered, is, you know, Rabbi Barclay never indicates why, like he says, like, hey, this is a hate unlike any other hate, but he doesn't actually state how it's different, right? Like he doesn't actually say like, this is how it's different. He just says like it happens for thousands and thousands of years. Well, hatred of all kinds of people has happened for thousands and thousands of years, right? And if you go back in history, you can see where has led to the mass slaughter of people. I mean, you've got Rwanda, right? Rwanda had the Hutu and the Tutsi, and the Hutu basically decimated the Tutsi, right, out of hatred. And you can look at Bosnia, where they had a civil war, and it culminated in mass graves and deaths, right? Right, like this is not exclusive to any one people, and it has been historically consistent. So if you're going to say, well, this kind of hatred is much, much different, then you might need to explain why it is different, right? Compared to any other kind of hatred that we have, that we can look at and observe historically. Um, as a listener, he needs to describe that. So I would know, like, why would I treat it separately, right? Um, and then also, if you're going to say that hate mutates, which is it's the version of that, racism is now prejudice plus power, right? Like the definition of racism has changed. It is not the definition that Martin Luther King Jr. used in the clip that I played, where he says, like, look, it's just about that your being is inferior. Like that was the old school definition, but now they have basically said, yep, racism has mutated to this new thing, right? Now you've got things like microaggressions and all this other stuff, right? So if, one of the things I think is worthwhile asking is, if we have a modern version that is different from what it used to be, then, and the big concern is, well, we want to make sure that things that happened in historically never happen again, then it's on you to indicate why the current version of hate, the current definition, would actually lead to the same end result, right? Um, and that's not presented. Now, in fairness to Rabbi Barclay, like they didn't really go that in depth into it. But I think if you're going to go on a podcast and you're going to talk about it, you should be prepared to answer those questions without even being asked, right? You need, because you might have noticed in the clip that I played, just that one clip, he's like, well, you're not understanding. And he says that multiple times throughout. He's like, well, you just don't understand. You just don't understand. Okay, fine. If we don't understand, then you need to come to the table better prepared. And I don't think he was prepared to really answer all these questions and say, all right, let me make my case, because all he did was just say it and then expect Candace or anybody listening to accept it. Like, hey, you don't get to define anti-Semitism. Okay, well, why not? Why is it that I cannot participate in that? Right? How is it that I am expected to observe and understand what is anti-Semitism, but I cannot observe and say, well, like it doesn't make sense that I could observe it in one hand, but not critique it in the other. If I can observe it, then I can understand it, then I can certainly understand what it might not be. Right? Like that's kind of like the other side of the coin. So therefore, he needed to come better prepared to make this argument. I mean, presumably he's been making it a lot over time and has met people similar to Candace who he believes doesn't understand. So at this point, you need to be prepared. I mean, you got a big, huge platform, and he didn't answer some what I would consider to be basic questions about his premise that, hey, you don't get to, you don't get, here's why you don't get to define it. Not you don't get to define it, end of story. You just sit back and listen and then say, man, I'm really sorry that I did that. And it just be super apologetic groveling. So, all right. The other thing I find that's problematic with this is that it perpetuates victimhood. Okay. But in a weird way. So let's play this next clip here. And this is the clip that's going to go a little bit backwards. So this clip actually occurred right before the first clip that I played of him and Candace. So let's play that.
I would just say off the bat, I do not accept that definitions can just mutate. That is something that I could debate that on, like the definition of a woman. I mean, I'm saying not just about Jewish people. I think that we have to have a concrete definition to work with, because then you can just update and say, actually, I've changed that, and now this is what constitutes anti-Semitism.
But Candace, that is the horror of anti-Semitism. So what you are saying to me is that anti-Semitism is this. It does not change. What I'm saying to you is that the entire world and scholars about anti-Semitism recognize that it is a unique hate. That if you define it as that you should not be able to exist collectively, okay, as a collective, they shouldn't have that right. That changes from the Middle Ages with religion, the 18th through 20th centuries about race, and then after Israel is created, it's a hatred based on the nation. And until that is understood, that it is, this isn't something that's really questioned about among academics, theologians, Jewish scholars. I'm not presenting it. This is why I thought that I'm so optimistic about a dialogue. But I think part of it is you view that the hate can't mutate. And what I'm trying to tell you is that we have 2,000 years of history that demonstrate the exact opposite.
Okay. So notice in there that he points to like academics, theologians, all these like intellectual type people. So when I say that I believe that this perpetuates victimhood, what I'm saying is it it allows the intellectuals to impose this idea on the masses. So in reality, he doesn't even allow for like certain Jews, regular Jews, to chime in because they're accused of being like at one point he calls himself hating, or he says that Jews can be anti-Semitic. So really what this is about is this is all of the intellectuals have said this, you accept it. You being whether you're a Jewish person or not, or right, like it anybody. Like if you're a Jewish person, you don't get to contribute to the conversation, right? And so I think this creates a certain level of victimhood because it it forces people who are in positions of power to define things in a way that the masses may not be experiencing. Because, for instance, she mentions Dave Smith at one point. Dave Smith, the libertarian comedian who's also Jewish, and he is anti-Zionist, and he was very critical. In fact, he had a podcast episode on this episode. So if you're really wanting, go ahead and listen to his as well. But basically, it's saying Dave Smith has to accept this idea because you're a victim. But Dave might say, well, in my travels all over the place and people knowing that I'm Jewish, I haven't experienced this. And so then he might say, I want to question this definition, whether or not it's actually a good definition. But instead, he would be told, well, no, you're just self-hating, or you're you're anti-Semitic yourself. So it's basically a way to shut down the conversation, but it forces people to to fall into this victimhood status. We're always a victim, right? And I think that's the insidious nature of how these definitions are treated, right? Like once upon a time, it was about the collective people, like they didn't have an opportunity to exist. Well, since they have an opportunity to exist, I guess that now it has to be about their race. Well, now it's not about their race. Now it's about their nation, right? Like once upon a time, they didn't have a nation, but now they have a nation. So clearly, the old definition no longer is valid. So there's a question there, like if if you moved forward away from the idea that you didn't have a right to exist, and you even got to the point where now you have your own nation state that is in some way supported by other nation states, and you have a certain level of wealth and power because the state of Israel is a first world state, first world country, right? They have a level of power, and I'm not talking like, oh, the Jews are controlling the world. I'm talking about like America, Germany, England. All these countries have a level of power in the world. They are unless the first world countries go at each other, the likelihood that they will survive and perpetuate the groups of people within those countries is extremely high. So you can no longer say, you just simply by fact, by the very nature of having a state that is well supported by other states, you can no longer claim that, hey, we're in fear of being decimated. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't say we're in fear of having attacks launched at us. That's clearly happened, but that's much different than saying, "Hey, this small group is going to annihilate us." They can't, right? They're just simply not in a position to annihilate you, because again, you now are like grown up and you have friends that like if a country made a serious attack on Israel, like a really serious like if Iran said, all right, we're going to just start lobbing some nukes over there or whatever, other countries are going to jump in, right? Like this wasn't the case many years ago. So I think what this does is it forces people to be victims by saying, well, now that problem isn't here, but this one is, and it's just as bad and concerning as the previous one. And that's because in our society, we have this problem where an organization or, some idea pops up to deal with an inequality or something that we don't like about the world. And we don't actually approach these things with the mindset that, you know what, maybe one day the reason that reason no longer exists and we can move on. We've solved it. It's kind of like saying like racism will always exist. What's up, little buddy? My producer's here. So it's like saying racism will always exist in some way, some form. We never beat it, but we got to keep trying to beat it. And so it forces people to be a victim and say, well, despite all the gains that we've got, it's still a huge problem. And there's this incentive for people to act like that, right? Because if I create an organization to deal with, let's say, the homeless in Jacksonville, let's say the homeless is kind of a problem, but let's say I create an organization to really help out the homeless. I have an incentive to have homeless people. Otherwise, I have no purpose to keep my business in existence, my organization in existence. And so let's say I get to the point where there are so few homeless that I'm practically twiddling my thumbs. Well, then I need to find some other reason for me to exist. And this is the argument against like race hustlers and other hustlers, right? It's like they keep inventing reasons to exist. Well, in order to do that, they've got to force people into this situation where they're victims. And the best way to do that is to not allow average everyday people to be part of that group that says, well, wait a minute, my experience is much different. I've had a pretty pleasant experience. Sure, maybe I ran across some dumb Nazis, that were holding a sign over a bridge. There were like a whole 12 of them. But I know way more than 12 people who aren't Jewish that are great people. And occasionally they make an inappropriate joke, but otherwise they're great people. I have a great relationship with them. And I feel secure living here wherever it is that I live, right? Like it doesn't allow people to participate in that conversation. That's why they have to say, well, you're anti-Semitic or you're self-hating. And this is applied in other areas too, right? Like this is what Candace Owens was saying. And she was like, this gives me great power if I believe that about race, very much like BLM did. And any black person that didn't get on board BLM, it was like, well, you just hate yourself, right? Or you're a racist as well, or you're part of the white supremacy, right? Remember what they did with Larry Elder. Larry Elder was a critic of this notion, this idea about racism and all that. And they were like, there was like an article that came out and it said the black face of white supremacy, right? And they basically were like, this is where terms like Uncle Tom come about. These are people that aren't playing ball that are saying, you know what? My experience, my observation is a bit different. Maybe we have moved forward and we don't need to worry about these things like we did in the past. That doesn't mean you don't worry about them at all. That just means that, hey, maybe society has moved forward and maybe we're no longer as terrible as we once were. Now we went from terrible to bad, right? So we've got some things to work on, but they're bad. They're not terrible. All right, I'm running behind here, so we want to get moving along here. So let's look at the next item here. So the next item is moral equivalency. So this is a very interesting one. So let's play this clip.
I have seen every single person, including myself, condemn what happened on October 7th.
So I want to point out here really quickly, she has. So again, Candace is walking through in this episode with Rabbi Barclay. She is walking through an article of criticisms of him toward her. And so she's now playing a clip of her on Tucker where he accuses her of not condemning Hamas.
Because who wouldn't condemn terrorism? It's obvious who would not condemn innocent Israelis dying. But if you then say that it is also sad when an innocent Palestinian child dies, suddenly this is pro-Hamas, or you need to say, even when you're talking about how sad it is that a child dies, you need to button that statement by saying, but that child was a human shield. That's not going to be my response. First off, as a mother, that's not going to be my response as somebody who is about to give birth. When I see these images of children involved on both sides of the conflict, I've pointed to the people that are mocking dead Israeli children and said that they are horrific. I am even keel on this matter. And yet people think that you need to be extreme. So people that have become more radical and extreme are perceiving a moderate stance as not enough. And
because I was about to say, people can disagree with you or agree with you or whatever, but you certainly don't seem radical on this topic.
And I'm going to hold here before you comment on that, because your next sentence, as you just said, she wanted to talk about the depravities of Hamas as an academic discussion and refused to even condemn Hamas. So we just saw that I did condemn Hamas. And regarding the academic discussion.
No, you didn't. I'm sorry. No, you made a moral equivalency between Hamas and Gaza.
I didn't do
There is no moral equivalency. What Hamas did is evil. It is not a tragedy only, it is evil. I'm sorry, Candace, but you make an equivalency that does not exist in most people's minds, and certainly in no Jews' minds.
Okay, so I'm glad that you said that, so people can hear what I actually said and hear what you are saying and how you are taking it. I don't know how you could write this statement, she refused to condemn Hamas, when I literally said who would not condemn these horrific events.
You don't condemn them uniquely evil. You put them in pari passu relationships.
So you're saying that even though I did, now you're admitting that I did condemn Hamas, he refused to condemn Hamas.
What condemnation is? Is this where you really want to go? Is have an English discussion?
No. You wrote she refused to condemn Hamas. These are your words.
That's when you put at the moment you say that they have a moral equivalency with anything else. That's not condemnation. No matter.
I didn't. I said it's sad when an innocent.
It's not condemnation. And
is
it's
it?
not.
I'll just ask you a question. Is it?
Okay, so I want you to pay attention very closely to this next question she asked him, but more importantly, how he responds, because this is what we're going to talk about in this moral equivalency.
Sad. Is it sad?
Sure. Sit there and do that.
I don't want to cut each other off, okay? Because clearly what we are having here is just a disagreement. There's no reason to get angry. Do you think it is sad when an innocent Palestinian child dies?
Candace, I cry every day. And it's not just for Israel. And this is one of the things you clearly do not understand. The same way most don't, who are anti-Semites, who don't get it. I cry for what's going on in Israel. I cry just as much for what we are forced to do. Golda Meir had a great quote. She said that one day we may be able to forgive them for killing Israeli children. We will never be able to forgive them for making us kill their children.
Okay, so the quote that he just gave, we're going to address that actually, because that's a very interesting quote. And after a couple of hours of research, I was kind of blown away by what I found. We're going to address that in just a moment. But I want to show you what I had. That was one of the first clips that I saw. It was that clip where he's, getting angry and he's like, look, you're making a moral equivalency. And I have addressed the moral equivalency on Twitter before. So let me just put that up on the screen and we're going to read what I said. I said, people claiming no moral equivalency in the Palestine-Israel debate are stating a belief. Deaths of innocent Israeli children and deaths of innocent Palestinian children are not morally equivalent. Now, that's a very strong statement, and I mean it. And let me describe what I mean. And I further went on and said, Barclay makes it clear when saying he cries for what they are forced to do. So in that clip, he was asked, do you think it's sad that when Palestinian children die? That's it. That was just a very simple question. Do you think it's sad? You can answer that with a yes or a no. More than likely, somebody's going to follow up with it in this particular context, right? So what he says is, he pauses, he gets kind of emotionally stirred up, and he said, I cry every day for Israel. Okay, so that has nothing to do with what she asked. Okay, she asked about Palestinian children. Then he says, I cry every day for what we are forced to do. Okay, but at no point did he actually just come out and say, well, yes, it is sad, right? And he could have taken that in a number of different ways. Now, I, as somebody who's anti-war, would not have accepted them necessarily, but it would have at least shown a measure of concern, of moral equivalence of the deaths of innocent children on either side of that border. Okay. And here's why I think what's going on is what's going on. When you have Um, the simplest way to look at it is you have intent, you have an action, and then you have a result. The intent was that Hamas is angry for whatever reason, and they want to harm some Israeli. Like they're angry at Israel for something, right? Whatever that something is, for existing, for maybe something that was done in the past, whatever. It doesn't matter. They have an intent. Their intent is to hurt, harm people in Israel. Then they take that intent and they put it into action. So they go and they fly over the border and they attack innocent civilians and they murder them in a very brutal way, right? And then the result is obviously that a bunch of people have died. Then you have on the Israel side, well, now they want to respond to Hamas, right? That's their intent. Their intent is we need to retaliate. So then they do retaliate. They drop bombs, and the result is that a lot of children die, right? A lot of innocent women and children die. People that do not have any level of power to affect any change in Palestine, right? That's what I mean when I say innocent people, right? That they don't have an opportunity. It's not like some 14-year-old kid. The 14-year-old kid in Israel, and I'm sorry, Gaza, may have been running around, saying all kind of foul things about the Jews, but they're expressing only what they've been taught. And even if they thought differently, they were in no position to do anything about it, right? Like they could say, you know what, turns out Hamas, you guys are all wrong, get out. Like they don't have any kind of power. So when I say innocent people, I'm talking about people that have no power to do anything different. And so you have this intent, action, and result. And the result on both sides is that innocent women and children are killed. And so when you make the claim that there's no moral equivalency, you are literally making the claim that there is no moral equivalency to the deaths of innocent people. And that's not a position that I take. I presume that's not a position that Candace Owens takes. We take the position that any innocent life that is killed is sad. Now, there may be extenuating circumstances, like he could have said, now again, I wouldn't necessarily agree with him, but he could have said, yes. And I really hate the fact that we're backed up against a wall and have to do this, right? Like he could have at least said, yeah, but he didn't. He didn't say yes at all at any point. He didn't answer that question. He walked around it and avoided answering whether or not it's sad, because I believe he doesn't see it as a sad thing, because he doesn't care. Because all he's interested in is Israel, and he doesn't care. He doesn't give a damn about Palestine, because if he did, he would have said so, right? I like, and this isn't like, oh, he just, he accidentally did. Like, no, he was asked a very direct question, and he's not a dumb man, right? There's no way that you could listen to that. Like, you might disagree with him on many things, but he's not a dumb man. And he knows what a simple question of, do you think it's sad? Yes, I do, Candace. I think it's very sad, and I wish we didn't have to do that. That would have been a way better answer. And it would have sounded at least like he had some sympathy for Palestinian children. But I don't believe it. Like, I don't believe he has any sympathy whatsoever. So my takeaway is that, and I've heard other people express the same thing. They'll say, well, you're making a moral equivalence argument. No, we're not, because we're looking at the result, not the intent. We're saying the result is equally horrific, right? It's equally horrific when an innocent child dies, no matter what side of the border that they're on. Now, if you want to back up and say, well, what about the intent? The intent of Israel is to retaliate against Hamas. Okay, I don't have an issue with that. The intent of Hamas is to wipe out Israel. I do have a problem with that. So yeah, I would say that they're not morally equivalent at that point. And then as somebody goes along, when they go from intent to action, and then we see the result, we can see that the moral equivalence may change, because we're talking about different people. At the intent level, we're talking about the intent between Israel and Hamas. But at the point of result, we're talking about the difference between two innocent people, right? Innocent Israelis, innocent Palestinians. They're entirely different people. So no, you don't get to just say, well, it's a moral equivalence. No, that's not what it is. But if you're refusing to answer the question, then that tells me from start to finish, you don't believe anything is morally equivalent, including the deaths of innocent people. Now let's get to that. That comment that he makes about from Golda Meir, because that was very interesting. And I initially wasn't going to put, but I have to put it in there because I literally spent like 2.5 hours researching this quote. So he gives this quote about Golda Meir, so who is the fourth prime minister of Israel from 1969 to 1974. So let's play this quote that he says. All right.
Golda Meir had a great quote. She said that one day we may be able to forgive them for killing Israeli children. We will never be able to forgive them for making us kill their children.
Okay, so the actual quote that I was able to dig up looks a little bit more like this, and this comes from her own book. So it's the only source that I could find, and the book title is "The Land of Our Own: An Oral Autobiography." It was edited by somebody else, but she initially wrote it, and you can find this on page 242. So here's what it says, and let me put it up on the screen so that, in a way that I can read it. So there's actually two quotes in here. Peace will come when the Arabs will love their children more than they hate us, from the National Press Club in Washington, 1957. And then here's the actual quote. It actually is not about children. When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. And this was allegedly from a press conference in London in 1969. Now, the distinction here, a lot of people, when you start looking and digging, you'll find that a lot of people recite this quote as children. And he's using this as a defense of killing children. He's like, look, this has been happening a while. We've recognized this. But a lot of people when I was doing my research, I found that a lot of people were arguing that because of the original quote being about sons, it's interpreted that what Golda Meir was actually saying was talking about soldiers, young soldiers, right? Because she's specifying sons, not sons and daughters and wives, right? And grandmas, sons. So it's explicitly talking about soldiers. So I thought, okay. And as I was digging, and let me tell you something, folks. When I dig, I can find. I'm very good at research on Google, on the internet. Like I am extreme. And here's the thing: if it's a press conference, and you are the prime minister of Israel, and you are giving a press conference, there is a record of it somewhere. So I should have been able to find it. And I found plenty of other things from the 1969 as well, 1970, 1973. I found plenty of videos of her, but I could not find any reference to a press conference in London in 1969. So I was like, okay, well, maybe my research skills are failing me at this point, right? Well, as it turns out, maybe not so much. It seems like maybe the uh, uh, maybe it didn't happen at all. Maybe that quote never existed. And you might say, whoa, DL, you're going to, because a lot of Jewish people have cited this quote, right, about a prime minister. And who am I to argue and suggest that it's not true, right? Well, here we go. Let's take a look. So this comes from the Jewish Star. Now, I want to point out really quickly here. Let me move my screen over. The Jewish Star is owned by Richter Communications, and as we can see here, it says the Jewish Star catering to the Orthodox Jewish community across Long Island and into New York City, reaching 30,000 plus weekly readers. Okay, so this is the owner. This is who owns the Jewish Star. So presumably, this is not some rag, right? This is a legitimate newspaper that reaches out, like it says, to the Orthodox Jewish community, presumably with Jewish writers. So this is not just this is not like a Nick Fuentes, a white supremacist writing about this. This is in a Jewish paper. So he says the title of it is "The Mystery of Golda Meir's Golden Gems." And he says, it's one of the most iconic quotes of modern Jewish history, universally known, revered for its heartfelt message. Yes. Well, if grandma's awake. It's one of the most iconic quotes of modern Jewish history, universally known, revered for its heartfelt message, and frequently cited by historians, biographers, journalists, and politicians, as well by ordinary citizens throughout the world, Jews and non-Jews alike. Peace will come when the Arabs love their children more than they hate us, right? We just saw that. It came from the book. But did Golda Meir, a signer of Israel's Declaration of Independence, who went on to serve the country in many crucial roles, including, of course, prime minister, to whom this august dictum is attributed, really say it? Right? He goes on, he says, but it never dawned on me to question the remark's authenticity, as I'd always assumed it was unassailable and indelible part of oratory history in a class with the immortal 7 years ago, and I have a dream. But doubts started to surface when I was researching an article on the greatest Jewish quotes of the 20th century. After rummaging through a plethora of sources and giving much consideration to a number of linguistic gems, I selected my 10 illustrious quotes with Meir's statements among them. The quote has been reproduced in countless books and articles in print, as well as online, and many of these cite their source, A Land of Our Own, an oral autobiography written by Golda Meir, edited by Marie Sirkin, and published by G.P. Putnam's Sons in 1973. The quote appears along with others on the last page of the book's text under the heading On Peace. Its source is given National Press Club, 1957, Washington, 1957. I wrote to the National Press Club in an effort to obtain a copy of Meir's 1957 speech. The response I received was that Meir, who at the time was Israel's foreign minister, did not speak there in 1957. She said she had, however, addressed a club luncheon on December 11th, 1956. Well, authors do make mistakes, and maybe Sirkin got the year wrong. Besides, December 1956 is pretty close to 1957. Fair point. The National Press Club did not have a copy of Meir's 1956 speech, so I searched far and wide for one. None of the repositories in the U.S. that I contacted had a copy, nor did they have any record of Meir's ever having made the statement I was looking for, right? So he's saying, like, after researching, going through all these historical places that would be expected to have a copy, nobody had it. It only comes from this one book, right? And then he says, it turned out that the Recorded Sound Research Center of the Library of Congress had a recording of Meir's National Press Club speech, but before I could get to Washington to listen to it, I obtained a transcript of the speech from the Israel State Archives. Breathlessly, I read it, but alas, Meir's quote was not there. So this comes from the Israeli State Archives, and the quote doesn't exist. Okay. With no primary source found, a previously unfathomable question came to mind. Did Golda Meir really say it? All right. So he goes on here, and let's see. Let's skip a little bit here because I don't want to read the whole article. Okay. As if the enigma of Meir's peace will come statement were not troubling enough, there is astonishingly another ultra famous quote, Meir quote, whose origin seems mired in doubt. When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill their sons. The possibility that Meir never really said this was brought to my attention by Jason Moaz, senior editor of the Jewish Press. He had been on the trail of his celebrated quote a while back, trying assiduously to find its provenance and ending up with the same dead ends and frustrations I did with the peace will come statement. Launching myself on a quest to track down another Meir gem, I got in touch with all the repositories and archives I contacted for the peace will come quote. One by one, the responses all came back carrying the same empty message. No primary source can be found for this quote. Let's see here. Skim down here. Let's see here. I'm skimming down a little bit because I don't want to read the whole article. Strangely, there are no citations for any of the quotes in the book. And while I found these two exact quotes in other books, all published in or after 1970, none of the citations were from original sources. Even more bizarre is that As Good as Golda was compiled and edited by Israel and Mary Schenker. Yes, the same Israel Schenker who several years later would write the massive New York Times obituary that contained dozens of Meir quotes, but notably not her two most famous ones. We'll probably never solve that particular puzzle, as Mr. and Miss Schenker have both deceased. Let's see here. Let's skip here. We're gonna go down. Give me just a second. Where is it that we want to go? Okay. So he basically ends saying, all said, it seems there are three possibilities. Number one, let me put that up a little bit higher. Oh, you know what? I don't have that. Can I do it that way? Why is it not? So I didn't realize that I'm cutting off. So I apologize, folks, that I'm cutting it off. I'll have the link in here. You can go read it for yourself. I apologize. I didn't realize it was cutting off some of the text. At any rate, he says, all said, it seems there are three possibilities. The words were indeed spoken by Meyer exactly as we know them today, and I was remiss, as were the various repositories I contacted, in not locating them in their original sources. Number two, Meyer expressed the thoughts in a somewhat different language, and Sirkin or someone else rewrote them all as the quotes we're all familiar with. Or number three, Meyer never said them at all. I'm going to go with number three, that Meyer never said those two quotes, specifically the quote about forcing us to kill their children. Now, here's some interesting tidbit about that. And it seems like, because as I was doing my research, some people in different forums were talking about it. And some people had pointed out that, again, if the original quote, the one that's from the book about sons, were true, then it was talking about young men of military age and unapplicable to killing sons, daughters, wives, grandmothers, so on and so forth, right? People that may in fact be innocent. Here's the thing. Number one, I did all the research, so I wanted to include it there because I thought it was interesting. When you come to the table to make an argument, you need to do the best that you can to ensure that your argument is a good one. So he doesn't really describe why it's a moral equivalency. He just demands that you accept it. Then he falls back, I'm talking about Rabbi Barclay. He falls back on a quote that actually appears to not even be a real quote. And again, I'm gonna have all the links in the show notes. Okay, there's a link to the online copy of the book if you want to, and you can go and read it for yourself. But I did clip the picture. That's where it comes from, and that's the only source that can be found is this book that was edited by somebody else. Okay, so it would appear there is no primary source. And as I pointed out, if a prime minister gives a press conference, there should be a record. No state leader gives a public speech without there being a record of it, right? Like maybe 200 years ago, they might have been one, right? But today, and this is like in 1969, in the 60s and 70s, we have audio, video, and transcripts of many, many speeches, right? And they don't, I mean, the Israeli state government even had the speech, a transcript of the speech that she gave at the press club here in the United States. It even had that. So the idea that they wouldn't have one from a press conference is absurd. And I think this is valuable because when we make the argument that you cannot argue with me, if I am presenting arguments that are untrue, who corrects them? He just put off the table me. He said, DL, he basically said, DL, you're not Jewish. You're not a rabbi. You're not an intellectual of any sort. You don't get to have a say. You can't tell me. Okay. But I just did the research and it seems like some of your arguments aren't even like your arguments based on others' quotes aren't even real quotes. How can, if you can't even be bothered to give me an accurate quote, or if I can find some logical problems, some realistic problems with your argument, why is it off limits to me? Right? We're not having a conversation. It's a one way, you do as I say. And I have to, again, hope that you'll find the errors of your ways and come back and apologize. If not, then I have to kowtow to your emotions. And that's like Candace said, that's not going to work for me. Not happening. Now, let's get to the last item here really quickly. There's this issue of double standards. And we're going to play this last clip and then we're going to talk about it and wrap it up because I've got to go here. All right. So let's play it.
I am extremely disappointed that I did not once hear, I'd like to give a concept called tshuva in Judaism. Tshuva means that when you've done something wrong, you recognize you did it wrong, you apologize for trying to fix it, you don't do it again. Makes for a healthy society. And I am extremely, extremely disappointed that not once in our conversation did I hear you take responsibility for what you said. You have taken responsibility. I'm sorry if that made you feel that way. I'm extremely disappointed that you have decided you have a clearer definition of anti-Semitism than Lord Sachs, myself, Ben Shapiro, etc. Going back, scholars, academics, whomever. I'm extremely disappointed that not once have I heard you say, wow, I messed up, Rabbi. I realize what you're saying. I understand what I did wrong. You know what? I'm not going to phrase it that way again. Using Shmuli's example, you could just say, you know what? You're right. I don't need to attack him and his daughter being rabbis. They're just bad people to me. I don't need to make a comment about a Hollywood gang of Jews. They're just bad guys who are running Hollywood that may have whatever relationships. You've tapped into ancient tropes that are anti-Semitic tropes. You have repeatedly demonstrated a hate for Judaism and Jews. Now, I'm hoping that will change, but it takes a certain level of self-awareness to be willing to say, I did wrong, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it differently.
He exhibits a double standard because the entire point of this whole video that she did with him was to talk about an article where she said, look, you said this about me. Here are the facts. You said this about me. Here are the facts. And he wiggles his way out of taking any kind of responsibility for anything. He wants Candace to say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. I didn't, I understand how you feel. But at no point did he do the same. He just weasels his way around and does not offer the same to her that he demands she offer to him. When two people are in conflict, you've heard the old saying, it takes two to tango. As a rule, almost 100% of the time, when two people are in conflict, there are errors on both sides. And at no point did he acknowledge any of his errors, nor did he really acknowledge any errors that, like she points out, Rabbi Shmuley, who him and his daughter had been attacking her for like 2 years. And he says, well, you should have just said that they're bad people, not, he's an unholy rabbi because of this reason and that reason. Right. He doesn't actually come out and condemn him. And it's interesting because, and it's not in the clips that I played, but he pretends as if he's totally unfamiliar with this, which I'm not really convinced that he is. Right. He wrote all this stuff. And he acknowledges in there that he was unfamiliar with 2 years of attacks by another rabbi on her. He acknowledges that he didn't really watch many of her shows, that he only saw some clips online or some Twitter post that she made. And that's what he drew this whole entire article about. And when she went to call him out and say, like, look, I think you've been unfair to me, he gets away from it. And he exhibits a double standard for which does not apply to him. And again, these criticisms are not, oh, the Jews do this. And if your takeaway from anything that I have said is that I am ascribing any of these behaviors explicitly to Jews, you are a fool. I want to make that clear so that you can snip that if you have to, right? You are a fool. These are common. This is common manipulative rhetoric, and it's not always done intentionally, although I think sometimes it is. Here, I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and just say he has learned how to engage in rhetoric in a very poor way, right? And again, to just summarize, he escapes criticism by continuing this definition and by offering no means for which somebody could say, you know what, this group of Jewish people, not all of them, but this particular group of Jewish people aren't doing so well. He says, no, you just got to say these people. You can't utter that they may be Jewish and collectively doing bad things that maybe other Jews would not find acceptable. You can't do that. You can just say they're bad people, But I would argue if you actually did, he would find some reason to criticize you for that as well. So I'm not even sure that I take him at his word. Like, oh, if you just said they're bad people, then I would accept that. I don't believe him. I'm sorry. If you happen to be watching Rabbi Barclay, you did nothing to give me that impression, right? That was your failing. I do not believe that you would accept that because you spent the entire hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes or whatever, escaping, creating conditions where you're escaping criticism. You demand that other people, you insist that other people are making moral equivalencies when it is in fact you and others who are making a moral equivalency, and you're not distinguishing between the moral equivalency of bad actors and victims, right? You're lumping them all in together and you're saying, look, because the bad actors are not morally equivalent, which is true, right? The bad actors are not, it is not morally equivalent. Like, it is an abhorrent thing that what Hamas did. It is not a abhorrent thing for Israel to say, we're going to respond to that and we're going to attack back at Hamas. That in itself is like, there is no moral equivalence there. But if their actions both lead to the deaths of innocent people, then yeah, there is a moral equivalence to the deaths of innocent people. And the fact that he couldn't bring himself to even say that, to say it is sad, to just simply acknowledge that it's sad, tells me that he's wrapping it all up together in one ball. And he says, look, we're forced to do this. So therefore, too bad, so sad. Sorry that your sons and daughters and grandmas had to die, but oh well, there's no moral equivalence in us having to fight them. We were forced to do it. Maybe we didn't want to do it, but you forced our hand, right? That's very abuser-like language, by the way. Like, every abusive husband has ever said that. You forced me to do this. You didn't clean the dishes properly, so I had to beat you. That's what every abusive husband has ever said, ever. That's abuser language. And then to hold a double standard, and at the very end to say, well, I'm very disappointed that you didn't take any responsibility. He should have been disappointed in himself. Start with yourself first. If you're not disappointed in your own self, you have no business being disappointed in somebody else for the exact same behavior. No business. You start with you. All right, folks, that's my show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative and inspiring. I want you to catch me Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, wait a minute, nope, not then again, that part. We're not doing the Sunday nights, folks. I'm taking a pause on that. I'll let you know if anything further changes. But make sure that you are subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer, my Rumble channel. You can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you're there, leave me a comment. Let me know how I'm doing. Last but not least, I want you to remember that if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.